Hello, everyone. Welcome back to First Principles. Today, we'll be talking about product management and products in general. And we've got Ashish with us. Hey, Ashish.
Hey, how's it going?
Very well. Thank you. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself or whatever you think is relevant for this particular portion?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Ashish Tripathi, and I've had a lot of experience in product management, so probably about 15 years or so, in different industries. I've come back. I was traditionally trained, or in college was trained as electrical engineer, embedded electrical engineer, and worked in aerospace when I first got out of college, and
Hmm.
um, worked for International Space Station, and then went into consulting for electric meters and with utilities, and that's really where I've got my feet wet with product management, and started learning about it with Siemens, and then kind of did a little bit of a startup exploration for a couple of years, and then, or not even a couple of years, maybe half a year, and then got back into uh, product management proper in at ABB with electrical trading, and really got my really honed the craft there, and kind of learned about what I'd like to do in product management and kind of my style at it. And then I went on to Home Depot and worked there in e-commerce. And then now I'm at Analect, which is an Omnicom company. And yeah, it's really just working with marketing and ad tech and working from that space.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this is, I had some of the questions planned, but I do have a few auxiliary questions based on your introduction, if you don't mind. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So, was so, I guess, incensed is the word, with everything being focused on electrons and software. And yeah, sure, software will lead the world, but you also need other things. I can't eat software. So it's good. It's almost, to me, I know it's maybe it's a personal thing, but it's almost endearing if folks have been product managers and they've been called product managers in companies that are not primarily software companies. So just one comment on that. Now, in this at this juncture in your professional career, it's obviously had quite an evolution. Do you consider yourself a product manager, a designer, or an engineer? Because I'm assuming you've had training in all three.
Definitely a product manager. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, I learned a lot of design when I was at Boeing, actually, and we went through a lot because I was creating simulations. So Boeing actually spent a lot of time training the developers in like human factors
Hmm.
for astronauts, when you're like, and what makes sense like as a signal, and those kinds of things, and an alert, and caution, and how things have to be kind of like, and it's very interesting because in software you kind of get those ideas and principles as well, in the sense of like, how much real estate do you have on a phone. Like now it's translated to like how much real estate do you have on a phone,
Hmm.
um but yeah, I mean, so I wouldn't say like I have some background in designer, but I definitely wouldn't call myself a designer. And from an engineer's perspective, I still think like an engineer, and still do software, and I can get around, but I definitely have focused on product as like the craft that I've been working in, and been trying to exceed my skills. So
Okay. Okay. So you said an interesting phrase over there. Think like an engineer. So perhaps tell us if you have like a well thought out hypothesis in your mind. Like what is it like to think like an engineer? And then perhaps later on the title of the episode, what is it like to think like a product manager? Just to start us off.
yeah, yeah, sure. Well, and I think it's definitely things that are ingrained. I think from engineering in general, you have to have a perspective of solving problems, right? Very detail oriented, um, those are the things that I think speak to engineers. Also, probably working very deep, like being in very deep work, where you can kind of focus on things I think spoke to me coming up as an engineer, and I think continue to speak to engineers often. And I will see that, right, in that when I work with software developers or work with software people that, oftentimes it's still like that, right? So I understand that perspective of like, what I've heard often is like, I've got so many meetings that, I don't have time to focus on, my programming, right? And so I think that is a perspective that's there. I think that's maybe a little different from product management, but where we are the same or where product management lends itself to kind of the way engineers think is that ultimately product managers and engineers were all trying to solve problems, fundamentally. And so I think it's just, you know, when I approach engineers, it's like just change the mindset of like, you know, you have to think a little bit further out. And I think that's probably maybe a difference is that, in product management, you have to take a look back a little bit further back from the individual problem that you're trying to solve or the very like detailed oriented and look at kind of more of the general picture and see like how does this one thing you're solving fit into the larger picture.
Mm,
And so I think that's where I've had to change my mindset and kind of get more into the aspects of saying like, okay, I'm trying to solve this for other people, but I need to actually understand who those people are and what are their problems versus like what is the problem that's being told to me by the product manager, right? Or
mm,
by the organization, right? Because sometimes it could be another stakeholder saying, like, hey, this is the problem I'm facing.
mm,
And a lot, I think when I was an engineer, I would just go with that, right? Like if I had a customer that came in as an engineer and said like, "Hey, this isn't working," or "I have this," I wouldn't take the extra step to really take a look back and say like, "Oh, well, what is your actual goal? Like, what is your actual problem?" Versus I would just say like, "Okay, yeah, like I'll take whatever solution you give me and fix whatever it is that is the issue." Sometimes it's it, I try to cultivate that like for developers too, they need to also think a little bit back and take a step back to say like that this is where it is. And probably the other thing is that um, you know, I think that the development, in the real world and unfortunately kind of going through school, it's not the same because you are kind of working very siloed. But in the
mm,
real world, like getting kind of that deep work or that time to get deep work is limited. But
mm,
it's because the job is actually like to work with others, right? Like to
mm,
work with others on the team. And so it's like so it's kind of like, yeah, it's like, you're working on a puzzle with multiple people that are all working on it versus like you have it by yourself. And I think that's really one of the changes that I had to understand and then try to cultivate with developers I work with,
mm. Okay, okay.
engineers that I work with. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking. I have two questions. I want to just deciding with myself in which direction I want to go. Okay, let's just do it. Um, in my opinion, engineering and design both are essentially and design very very broadly defined, and engineering very broadly defined are using a certain like different kind of like fundamental skill sets. In terms of engineering, it's probably natural sciences, and in design, I'm not sure what it is. I want to find out later on. But ultimately, trying to solve other people's problems to create value, extract value. Fine. That is a fun thing I get. So now, as a product manager, do you deal with designers? And again, very broadly defined, could be engineering design, could be
Sure,
UX
sure.
UI,
Yeah.
or service design. So do you deal with that in a different way versus you would deal with engineers. And I don't mean specifically people, but like the interaction of
Yeah.
the people and the problem spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Definitely, I definitely do because again, I think coming from, you know, development background, engineering background, um, and I was an embedded engineer, so I was coding, I was coding a lot too, right? And I understand, and I coded Java and all that lot
Yeah.
years ago, right? And database
And
stuff.
embedded, so like functional thing, not even object oriented, so much closer to the yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yes, yes. And but and so where I guess where it comes out is that I do think and I think this is it, and I've talked about this in some of the articles I've written too, that like, really getting your message across, right? Because like product managers don't really lead with like authority, right? It's like through influence, so one of the important aspects of that is you need to know your audience, right? Like, so when I talk to developers, I feel like I know who they are. And so the way that I approach them and the things that they're concerned about are different than the things that like a UI UX developer will like, or a service, designer will be, or even an architect, so I think all of those things come into play. So I definitely will try to tailor my message towards them, and not I'm not trying to say this to be insidious, but like, obviously I want to be able to influence what they have to say. But then there's also I understand what they're good at and where their strengths lie. So then I want to make it in a way that they're free to talk about those things without feeling like, um, like closed off from saying that to me, right? So it's like, it's both, right? There's like kind of a push and pull because, like, for example, like UI UX, right? And look, I love working with UI UX partners, and I think they're really great. But oftentimes, UI UX will want a lot of features that maybe don't make sense right away, maybe don't make sense at the time, or even maybe aren't technically possible, and so you have to balance like there. And I think that that dichotomy, or like that struggle between product and UX is necessary, right? To get like a better solution. And I face something similar with programmers, right? In the same sense of like, maybe I want more than what the developers want to provide most of the time. And so, it's like there's like some sort of balancing act between all three of those groups, right? Like in the sense of like in just day to day, I would say like, where you have UI, UX will want like a bunch of stuff, and then I'll have to kind of tailor down, and then I'll want, a bunch of stuff from the developers, and then they'll have to, help me convince me that like, maybe it needs to be less. And, really that's the job for product management in general, because even with stakeholders, it's the same like stakeholders will definitely want more, right? Like than maybe you can, provide at that time, or, customers will want more, than you can either provide at the time, or so you have to be able to have those conversations and say like, hey, like I know you want, these 10 things, but look, you really only need these two, right? Or these three are the main focus, and you'll get better value out of these three, and you can get it earlier, or whatever the case is. So
Okay, let's double click this. Product
yeah.
management is not, you said, doesn't typically they don't have executive authority or direct authority, so they lead by influence. Why is that? And is that by design?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, right? Like I guess in every org that I've been in, right? Like it's never really like the product manager is the boss, right? Like I mean, like it's usually functions separately than usually separate than development, right? I know that there is kind of a trend now of like CTO is also the PO, like so CTPO or whatever, like I know there is some of that and definitely like I think in startups like the CEO is kind of like, got the vision for the product and has definitely in so I think sometimes why you'll hear that phrase of like the mini CEO or whatever, or CEO of the product for product management is kind of there. Because I've seen that too, right? Like I've seen that where like the CEO is the person who, kind of came up with the product and the vision for the product and but when you start to scale and maybe he's not really able to do that anymore, she's not able to do that anymore. So I mean, I think it prob so what I'm getting to is that in those like startup situations, maybe they have more authority. At least in my career, I have always had not no authority or not much authority over the developers or UX. They've always kind of been independent constructs in or independent orgs in where I've worked. So yeah, I think it is. I think it is ultimately though, you know, part of being a product manager and because even like CEOs and whatever, like the idea of like autonomy and like, independence is I think is like a myth, really in some ways, because even the CEO, right? Like, and even when I've worked with CEOs, like, they'll come in and they'll say like, "Hey, we want these three things," or get this done, and yeah, it's like you have to do those things or you have to give them more attention, but it's not necessarily like that they're like you still have to balance that with everything else, right? Like you can't be like, oh yeah, well, like, yeah, let's just go, like, yeah, you want to win this customer, great, right? Like, but is it going to be at the cost of all the other customers that you have already or business as usual? Like, like maybe that's, you have to be able to balance that. And the CEO probably had to balance like before the organization was big and you're in a startup, you have to balance that with those other stakeholders that you have, right? Or the other
Yeah,
boards.
but who does the buck stop with? Who does the buck stop with? I'll give you what my problem with this particular trend is. And this, I think I was reading Mark, not reading, I was listening to Mark Andreessen's various podcasts, and he talked about the managerial capitalism and the bourgeois capitalism, the old kind of capitalism, where you figure out whatever the private investment is. It's like a mini monarchy, right? I mean, of course, it doesn't have to be, it can be a benevolent monarchy, but it's
Yeah.
essentially a monarchy. So you get it done, right? Now you can ask your, and again, I like to quote this. You might have read this, heard this in my objectivism episode as well, where Henry Ford allegedly said that if I would have asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster
Yeah.
horse. So where,
Yeah.
where, where does the buck stop with? There has to be a creative decision, executive level decision making, saying, hey, I disagree with all of you, people who are above me, people who are below me, even my customers, because I know what is best. Sometimes that's
Yes.
a useful approach.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, I think that that's definitely, necessary, right? Like, I
Mm.
mean, disruptive. I mean, you actually see it much more now, right? With the like Uber and DoorDash and these are all things that were not necessary, like you don't like it's a disruptive sale, and the idea of sales, right? Like no one needed Uber or DoorDash before, right? Like
Mm.
potentially, right? Like
Yeah.
and in B2B you definitely I mean I would face that a lot, right? Like in B2B, right? Like and I think that's probably why it's kind of gone towards like product led a lot, right? Like it's like, oh well, here's the product for free, and if you want it for more, then like, so, but ultimately, I mean, I think you can. I don't necessarily. I think you're right, but I think from its in a lot of ways, like the market has changed in like because like, yeah, there's a monarchy, but it comes from that history of like the army, right? Like where there's a hierarchy, right? Like, I mean, the way capitalism works and the way it kind of, you know, like the way business works is a lot of it was, and definitely project management is like definitely modeled after like military projects, right?
Oh,
And
is it? Okay. That's
yeah,
interesting. I didn't know that. Okay.
yeah, yeah. So it's
Yeah.
like, so it's very hierarchical, right? Like, so that's
Okay.
why, like,
Command and control. Literally, it's called command and control. Right,
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 right, right,
right.
right.
So,
Mm.
I mean, and we could even like even Scrum has some history with, plane fights and all that, right? Like, so, it's like, and so that has a military aspect as well, right? Like, um, but, um, but, I think where it is for product management is, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that at some point, right? Like you can definitely do that, right? And you can definitely, and I've thought about this a lot for the history of products, right? Like, so if you look at it, right, like most of the time, products were kind of like, before, the way products kind of started was it was more of a like, you know, um, way, way back as barter system. So they had to have some sort of intrinsic value. But it's like the idea of like you're bringing the product to the market, right? Like, so you've already made the product and you're bringing it to trade, so it has the value, right? But
No, no, no,
now,
stop. No, no, no,
go
stop,
ahead.
stop. I really,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
want to double click on this. This is too good to miss. Okay.
yeah.
My impression. So I also watch Robert Breedlove's "What's His Money" podcast. I like his definition of what a product is. Ultimately, he says, like when he's distinguishing in an economic theory kind of way between a product and a service, he says everything is a service because you buy it
Sure.
based on your personal utility, based on what services it's going to give to you. So that part I agree. I'm just trying to square that with what you said initially, that there is going to be initially products would have come in because they might have had some intrinsic value. Now, Austrians say there is nothing as intrinsic value. But then I guess one way you can translate this is if enough people think something is valuable, then we can say it has intrinsic value. So are you saying that the initial products were like collectibles, like gold, interesting things, things that give you status, or the initial products were of use?
Well, I think there's a little bit of both, right? And
Hmm.
I talk about this for product management is that, I think, you're part of the product, like, you can't untangle the product from the marketing. Because even if you go back to like antiquity, right, with like wine, right? Like, so like wine was one of the things that was like traded in like ancient Greece and the Mediterranean, right? Like, and they would travel to China with it and Africa and whatever, and they would bring it along, but it had kind of a marketing effect because it came after, potentially like after beer, right? So if you look at it from that kind of perspective, right? And like, so there was a marketing campaign by the Mediterranean to be like, hey, wine is like much better than beer, right? Like only
Yeah,
these
have this discarded beer
sophisticated,
shit.
yeah, like only barbarians and people up north who can't be in the sun, and in this nice weather, like drink beer, right? Like
I
that
like that.
there's something civilized about like drinking, wine, right? And so
Yeah,
there's marketing include like even if you look at tea, I mean Indian, tea, like even if you look at tea, right? Like it's the same, like sure tea has is intrinsic value and China was using it as
sure.
food, like, but then
And
if
a
you look at,
drug and medicine, but yeah,
yeah, yeah, it was, yeah, and like, it has antiseptic qualities because you're heating up the water, and same thing with like beer and wine, right? Like, so even if you look at those as like products, but there's definitely like tea wouldn't be the drink it is today if it weren't for the marketing efforts by like British imperialism. You know what I mean? Like it definitely wouldn't be like where it is today if it weren't
yeah,
for those. Like,
yeah,
um, those marketing efforts. And even originally like by the Dutch, right? Like realistically, tea, coffee were trying to become products from the Dutch, take Dutch coffee, taking it from, the Middle East, and then trying to like, grow it in Indonesia with Java, and like, that's like, I mean, so it's like, so like, don't get me wrong. I think you're like, I think there's an intrinsic value, but it is, I mean, I guess to your point, like there's an intrinsic value, but you're selling that value as well, right? Like you're marketing that value as well. And I think that is part of product. So don't
And the
get me
story
wrong.
behind it and
Yeah.
everything. Oh, you the barbarians
Yeah.
do this and the non-barbarians do that. Everything. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and I've been in that situation. I've been in that situation, right? And you've probably seen that situation. That like, if you look at certain products objectively, like, that you might say that like this is the superior product, or I've even
Mm,
been on the side where I've provided a superior product, but the marketing behind the other competitors or behind another product is like so much better, right? That like people will buy that product instead, right? And
mm,
it's more, it's not even like, it's not even because people think about it objective. Like if people were rational, then the stock market wouldn't be what it is today, right? Like,
mm.
like it is the way it is because, and the one I like to look at is, the iPod, right? Like if you look at the iPod, definitely like Windows had MP3 players of much like just specifics, right? Of just like the ability to like store more music and
Yeah.
have everything, but like, what Windows didn't have, or what Windows, products, MP3 players didn't have, like, the Zen was like, the example, but like what Zen didn't have is it didn't have a marketplace for people to like, get the music. And so then that was kind of, where do I get my music from? Like, where do I get my MP3s from? Right. And it didn't have that like there was definitely a marketing factor about the iPod, which Apple then leveraged into the iPhone and all that, right? But there was a coolness factor of like, oh, like it's only one button, and like I can kind of slide, and there was and the advertising, everything was like
But see,
definitely like created.
the important part is that this was not designed by committee. Because if there it's going to be designed by committee, everybody's idiosyncratic asks will have to come into the committee, and then we get the lowest common denominator instead of the highest common factor. And I think you need some dictatorial powers to get the highest common factor and accountable dictatorial powers, because if that person needs to put the money where the mouth is. So if it fails, they take the hit.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, but I don't think Steve Jobs, and obviously this is my opinion, but I've
Yeah, yeah.
read things that like Steve Jobs isn't necessarily as dictatorial as like maybe like
Lest you put
and maybe he was, but I've read articles about how people would persuade him. And this is getting back to my point, right? About that, like with influence, right? About like how people in his design team would talk to Steve Jobs to make him do like what they ultimately wanted to, right? And influence him to do like the kind of
manage up.
right. Yeah,
A lot of
exactly. Right.
politicking going on here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I think even he like there, and I can't exactly remember, but it was something about the iPhone that he didn't want to do the phone for a long time, and they like were able to influence like saying like, oh, like look at like what this other company, like look at what BlackBerry is doing, and like that they did it on purpose to kind of make him be like, oh yeah, well then like let's, what I mean, like. And so ultimately, and I mean Steve Jobs is like a perfect example even of like, because he got kicked out for a while from Apple, right? Like, and so I think you can be like Victorian, and there are definitely products that are good that come out that way. And I mean that and that's ultimately what I was saying like before, right? Like you're bringing your products to market, right? Like the history was like that, right? But now I think we're in, because of like software products becoming more popular, right? It's kind of like you don't necessarily have to have, and this is why MVPs kind of work more now, right? It's like you don't necessarily have to be like, oh, well, here's all the value that you can get from this product, and this is why you need to buy it, right? You could say like it's part of your strategy, or like part of your marketing is be like, hey, this will help you in some of these things, and so here it is for free, and then here's the rest of the product, in this way, or like you can come up with fast prototypes like way quicker and be like, hey, this will solve your this one item really well, and we want to pay for it, so or you can pay for it, so that's why we go. So it's like
Yeah.
I think there's less capital that you have to spend to try and get your products out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like before it was like, yeah, if you look at Ford or like Tesla or somebody, it's like he loses like his whole life is savings is invested in the product, right? And it's like even Jobs is that way. Is like his whole thing is invested, right? Like in the product, it's like so he's got a lot to like risk, right? It's like so in that way it's like maybe you can be like, oh yeah, well, I'm the boss and this is the way I'm going to do it and this is how it is. But I think to get to a point where you can really scale and get out of it and move up, then you have to be able to say like, I'm going to lead by influence and not necessarily like um, like being
Direct force.
yeah, like
Yeah.
authoritarian about it because and I've even found like, that motivates people more,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. It's easier to lead.
yeah, yeah. If you can figure out how to convince somebody else that they want to do this, then it's way easier to lead that like like than it is to say like, oh no, like this is the way we have to do it, and you're like so I think that's the way to
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
approach
No,
it.
I mean, I think your narration has given me like a bit of a meta theory that I'm gonna test it out on you. So I'd say like primarily, human beings materially need like two categories of things, two categories, just two. So one is the basic, the Maslow's hierarchy, right? Essentially, the food, shelter, physiological needs, right? And
Yeah,
then ultimately, then they want something. Then once those physiological needs are taken care of, and one could argue some people need something more than others. So, like I guess fresh air, living in a very very fresh countryside will be more important to somebody with bronchitis than not. Okay, once
sure.
that's done, what they probably are going to just human beings just want and want and want, and that's what we seem to do. So we perhaps need a machine that just gives us what we want. The problem with scale is the artisanal capability, in the sense that the customization that a person singularly might desire goes away, right? Because you can't sell it for cheap. If you want to sell it for cheap, go hire somebody and ask them to make a Mercedes Benz only with hands from ground up. Good luck, right?
Sure,
And so some things can't even be delivered without the scale. Like there is no artisanal version of an airplane. You can't do that. You
sure,
cannot
sure.
replace, right? You can't replace them. You can't have 15,000 people running fast and just fly. There's no equivalent to that. So
Yeah,
unless you are creating the kind of um, Star Trek replicator machine that everybody guarantee will want, and I guess then you don't need business after that. If if it tends to self-replicate, unless you're building that, anything else and everything else is will have to be produced through for a few people, like a niche, and then all the sociological factors, including the factors where people are politicking and eyeing for influence, violence, and competition. All of these things are transformed into a productive wealth creation activity. All those impulses and that people have.
yeah,
So that's why I don't really fault anybody, because we don't really know, right, that what's the formula. Where do ideas like how do you for sure keep getting perpetual progress, materially speaking? Where do ideas come from? We don't know. So these fields are
yeah,
more heuristics, right? They're not hard sciences.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, I would even say that like even if we did get that Star Trek, you know, device,
Mm.
I don't necessarily think that that will satisfy
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
the
yeah. But yeah.
to satisfy the people either, right? Because and I think that's one of the things, like, as a product manager, I definitely have to guard myself about, right? And I think like I was saying, I guess to bring it back to initial, right? Like that one of the difference from like an engineer to now, right,
Mm.
is that, I would used to think I used to just go with whatever solution was kind of told to me, right? But now I'm much more critical of solutions that the customer offers, that the CEO offers, that a stakeholder offers, right? Because it's not necessary, like, because you really need to see them in the wild and give them different options. Like, because I don't even think, like, I don't even know that the solution that I work on is actually gonna meet the needs of them, right? And so, like, getting that feedback and having that kind of, feedback loop with the customers and yourself with the developers is vital, because it's people's impression will be different when they actually get their hands on it and start working with the device, right? Like, even if we go back to the iPod, like, iPod was great, and like people looked at, but if you went in there and worked on it and it sucked, like the inner, like that button sucked, right? Like, and you hated it and nobody knew how to work it, right? If it wasn't intuitive, then the product probably would have failed, right? Like, and then so in software, there's definitely a lot of that. And, that's where, I'll lean on UI, UX designers, right? To be like, hey, this is too much cognitive load, or this is the way to go. But yeah, I mean, I think most of the time, we're pretty awful at like predicting like what we'll want in the future and what
Yeah.
those solutions will be in the future. So it's better to just give them a lots of options, especially in software, like give them lots
Mm.
of options and say like, hey, these are the options. And to the world outside of software where I've worked as well, right? Like, you can do that too with, pre-selling and showing people what's available beforehand and seeing like kind of the buzz for that. Are people interested in that? Because you'll never know, right? You'll never
Mm.
know, right? Until
Mm.
it's like until it happens, right? Like Home Depot, there was that the no one thought the 20-foot skeleton was gonna be the number one seller for Halloween, right? Like, we sold out of it, like super quickly, right? Like, no, and that's like, no one can predict that. No one can predict that, right? Like, it's like
Yeah.
one of those things that you can't predict, right? Like, that it's gonna pop off virally and then become like a logistics nightmare to get more,
How known
like
is this though?
skeletons.
How known is this? You said you can't predict that. It's an excellent example of the whatever the 20 feet skeleton.
Yeah.
How known is this in the personnel working in relevant teams, right from executives to this? Like, you can't really predict. You can't really, because I feel like there's a lot of LARPing happening, right? Live action role play. So how we know this? I mean, like, how do you know, right? And then
Yeah.
and then I guess it's fine to not know, but then who does the buck stop with? So like, if it fails, who is at a loss? Because the worst thing is, you would like pig-headed about your decision, and somebody
Yeah.
else takes the head.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, I mean, I think that's really, with the org. I mean, I think it happens, right? Like, product manager does kind of, fall on the chopping block if something doesn't work out, right?
A lot
And
of them have
there's different
this
reasons,
generally.
right? But like, I could say that, like, typically, like, when I try to guard myself from that, in that I try to set the criteria, the goals of what the initiative is on the front, and say like, this is, we don't know if that this will be successful. Like, there's ways to guard, like A/B testing is a fantastic mechanism to leverage, right? To like pretty accurately define whether you're going to be successful or not, right? Like, and so if you have that mechanism, then that's great. That's a way to do it. But yeah, I think having the identifying what success, but then the other side of it is also identifying like what decisions are you making along the way. And because sometimes something that will be a goal will fall by the wayside, because and it's because the stakeholders have decided, right? Like, and I'll present them with, hey, this is, this is going to be off schedule because of, this, or these are the three options. You can have it tomorrow, you can have it 6 months from now with this, or you can have it, a year later with all the bells and whistles. What do you guys want to do? Or like, or we have this compromise that can get it sooner, but it's going to be, man behind the machine or a wizard behind the, curtain kind of thing. Um, and and when those decisions happen, I document it, right? So that they know, right? Like, hey, like we all decided this together, right? It wasn't just me who said like, oh, this is a and so I think that's really where, if you can say that story, then you'll be safe from those kinds of like outcomes, right?
Mm,
Where it's like, where, yeah, you don't know. And they need to the people, everyone needs to understand that when you go into it, right? Like, hey, this is, the MVP is not going to be the solution for everyone, for all cases and all scenarios. And it may not, and it may not even be the best case, right? Like it might not even work. So that's why sometimes you'll hear people talk about MVPs being like the most risky as well. Like, so sometimes people will take the most risky assumptions, right?
mm.
And say like try to test those. And I think that's valid too. So like in some of these disruptive ones, like maybe people won't have it, but again, I think it's like I think I mean, if we really get into it, I mean, I even think that there's some self-preservation that happens in your org, right?
Yeah.
Because like, especially if you don't pick the metrics in the beginning, and even if you do pick the metrics in the beginning, sometimes, right? Like people will come back and use, confirmation bias will just be like, oh yeah, we met that goal because like here I found all this evidence that confirms that belief, right? And
Yeah.
it's like, so the ideal situation is to be in an org that like recognizes that these are bets that you're making,
Yeah.
and that, the product and what the risk is for those bets,
Mm, mm. And
um
sometimes be comfortable that you probably won't know what the proper risk is, but these are all your best case assumptions. And finally,
yeah
when you're trying to measure like OKRs and metrics, do understand that these are not like lines in the sand, because the way you communicate this to your employees downstream, they think this is gospel. It's not. And you need to
yeah
understand that. And maybe it's by design that employees downstream think this is gospel. The folks who can think, they see through the BS, and then you kind of lose trust because you are not being forthright with them. You obviously want thoughtful people working for you in these difficult problems in knowledge work, right? So you
yeah
can't
yeah
like distance them like that. Okay.
yeah
um how do you all of this sounds a lot like project management as well, so how do you distinguish these two?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have a history as a project manager, and I had a project management certification as well. And the main difference to me, well, so I think the commonality for management, right, is that management facilitates communication, right? And it also facilitates removing barriers. I think those are two things that are necessary, both in project management and product management, right? The difference, and this is really the main difference with project management and product management, right? Is that project management, and we can talk about like fixed cost versus, like
Yeah.
hours based or whatever. But I think originally project management was typically it was fixed cost project, and most of the time,
Yeah,
you
Manhattan
had,
Project, basically that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So most of the time in the history of projects, they were like they were fixed cost projects, right? So you would go in, the reason you needed a project manager was because you were only getting paid, $10,000 for this project. And this happens, maybe in your home remodeling or at the house, right? Like this is how projects work in real life, right?
Yeah.
Is that you say, the the vendor will
Contract.
say like, hey, I
Yeah.
can do this for $10,000. And you want to make sure that you can get all this stuff done with the materials and the labor and all that stuff for less than $10,000 so that you make the profit of whatever the difference is between the cost and the project, right? And that's still true for a business, right? Like that's the whole reason you need so the difference between product management and project management is that project management has typically a fixed set of requirements, and it also ends, right? Like you finish, and now I know products have a life cycle as well and that kind of thing
Yeah.
too. But the difference between product management and project management is that product management has it will you will continue to be with that customer over time, right? And you want
Yeah.
to continue to have that thing. So there's no like definitive end. And I know there is like you can talk about the end of a life cycle of a product and end of projects and so
Yeah, we'll
I've
get
done
there.
that, right?
Yeah.
But it's a different mentality because it's almost like a negotiation, right? Like in the sense, in some ways, like in project management, you can kind of have a win-lose situation, right? Like in the sense, like, and if we were talking about money, right? Like the project, is the win, and
Yeah.
the customer kind of loses in that case because they're paying you more money, right? I mean, you're getting that overhead as profit. I mean, that's how it
Yeah.
works, right? Um, whereas a product, it could be your negotiation almost needs to be a win-win because the customer and the product has to be in a scenario that's good for you and good for the customer, that they ultimately are feeling like, yeah, like this is a good solution for both of us, right? Like, and that I want to continue using the product or coming back to your brand or whatever to keep going. And so that's really kind of the difference, like I think when it boils down to it, like that's where I find it. And so, do I think there are parts of product management? And, this is where it gets really gray is like,
Yeah.
I think organizations and people mix project management and product management together. Yeah, because some of the activities are so like, like when you build a product, yeah, maybe you have dependencies and maybe there is like a launch date. To me, it has a lot of project management type aspects to it, right? Like because there's a definite end of the launch, right? Like you're gonna have
Yeah.
all these marketing efforts that are gonna go into it, and extra money is gonna be spent. So it's like,
Mm.
so I think that's kind of the main difference I find is that um, you know, but it's really what I didn't do as a project manager, and I would say that this is kind of more, and sometimes you'll see this as a consultant, right? It's like sometimes as a consultant is probably more like a product manager than necessarily a project manager. But you'll have project managers in the consultancy, right? But the idea is
Yeah.
like you're coming in there to go in and you're saying like, hey, these are the ways that we can make things better, for you as the customer. And I think that kind of mindset has to be there in product management. Whereas project management, it's like, how can I most efficiently get done what you need to get done, right? Like,
Okay.
like, and finish it up, right? Like,
Much more
if
brass tacks. Again, very, I smell military here.
yeah, definitely very military. Yeah, because it comes like, yeah, if the army needs to build a bridge, like, I don't want
Hey, build a
somebody
bridge.
in there
Dilly
thinking,
dallying.
yeah, like, well, what's the best for, like, Cambodia or Vietnam when I go and build a bridge, right? Like they don't care, like it's just about like getting the bridge done, right? Like you don't care about the consequences, like maybe afterwards, right? Like,
Sometimes it helps because
yeah.
if you're going through a stagnant society, maybe a massive spending program built by the military tends to rev up the economy and people feel more confident about the economy. I mean, so we've learned a few things. Libertarians say, no, it's all should be natural. Yeah, nothing's natural. And then you won't have evangelist movements or things to. Like, there will be no kind of propaganda or advertising. So that is a good thing. I mean, yeah, yeah.
right?
maybe it's a good way to sort of like categorize management, because I think you're right. Project and product are kind of fuzzy. Then, but I mean, given your definition, I'd say an agile project manager, somebody using Scrum and agile methodologies a lot, mostly working in, and again, I use this terminology carefully, mostly working in a partner kind of situation, not working in a vendor kind of situation. Because in a partner kind of situation, you are kind of developing the requirements together, and there is at least on in theory equal respect. There is no like, the client is big and I'm the provider. So maybe this is not a useful distinction. The useful distinction is a functional manager, a cross-functional manager, and then perhaps a technical manager. So if you are in any field, so it can be technical manager of design, or technical manager of embedded systems, or a particular programming or whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe at the very large level, these are the only three things that we really care about, and there are challenges in cross-functional management. So my next question: do you necessarily need to be a renaissance man, or I guess the term nowadays is the M-shaped skills? So deep specialization in at least like 2 to 3 skills, and then broad knowledge of decent number of skills relevant to you know the project. Do you think only these people can get attracted to this?
So I've thought about this a lot. So my brother-in-law is of the opinion that you should be very specialized, just in the case of like to be very like secure in your job and very like marketable and
Hmm.
I've even seen this in some ways to myself, right? Because like I still have like embedded stuff in my resume and I still get calls about like embedded jobs, even though I haven't done it, for like
Yeah.
10 years, right? So like, um, so it's like it's a very specific kind of knowledge and very specific like thing that knowing about those things. So like so do I think you need it? And, like, I would say for a product manager, and this is my opinion about product, but I think you get a better product by being a generalist and understanding things kind of outside of the like very specific details and saying like, oh, well, how will marketing engage with this? And like, how will we go to market with this product? I think, and just as we were talking before, that like the product is coupled with the market, right? Like the marketing of how you do it. Um, so I think it works better to be a generalist to actually kind of think about those things you know like
Yeah,
business
yeah,
in
yeah.
general versus like
Mm.
just like the technical things of like what you're working in. And I also think now I also think a lot of the best products are these ones that kind of look at things from a broader perspective and kind of bring them together, or like a different perspective and kind of bring them together. So I think those kind of happen from generalists. So I think maybe there's that, right? Like, but I say that, but there's definitely very, successful, very specific niche products, that are like that, like only like, someone who's like really in the technical, like I'm sure there's probably some sort of like 3D printing piece that's like very specific that only gets produced and like, someone's probably making a killing on it, right? Like, and I'm sure that that's, useful, but like,
Yeah, no,
like,
I
yeah,
agree. I mean, I think one alternative is that I guess the dichotomy can be solved in one way. One way is jack of all trades and master of none. No, not that. Jack of some trades and master of some. I mean, that's a
yeah,
decent amount of generalization. And then depends on the context as well. So, whatever field that you just described, maybe only 14 people specialize in that. And then let's say this person is also a specialist in a field which only is like 15 other people. So, there is a point of diminishing returns where you need to know like where to stop. But I do think
yeah,
if you educate yourself in fundamental disciplines, so like natural sciences, philosophy, theology,
yeah,
people, those things are so like again they're so abstract, but they because they're so abstract they can be so relevant in super specialist things that you can at least attempt to think hey, whatever is happening in that little domain, is this just like fraud happening where you're just taking money from National Science Foundation and not doing anything? Or maybe something is genuine and people are just throwing more money at it. At least you can have an
Yeah.
opinion. I'm so scared of like these silos where nothing comes together. We just, we're back to, I don't know, that's like the end, because how do you come together? You need to be able to form an opinion on somebody else, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, this is I do think about this a lot, because I don't think we are ants that we are super specialized in one thing. But we are not jaguars either, super generalists. So we have to see.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that everyone is like that, right? Like,
Hmm.
it's like you can't like, like people that you work with, like or even if we, look back at like Steve Jobs again, right? Like it's like, he was really into design and stuff,
Hmm.
before like and
Yeah.
font design and things like that, like
Yeah.
which
Never coded.
like which you wouldn't necessarily think makes a big impact, but it does, right? And so
Hmm.
like I think, would I say that he is a general, like I would think that he probably is a generalist, right? Like he's into like all these other
But it's
things, right? Like,
dips in
that
design. He's really into
yeah,
design, but yeah, mostly generalist.
yeah. So it's
Yeah.
like, so, I think that you gotta do that. But again, on the other side, like my brother-in-law, like I said, is very specialized, and it's very secure. Like, and you can see that too with some like Fortran, like if you can program in Fortran, like there's still a job market out there for people who can code for Fortran because no one codes in it
Oh yeah,
anymore,
yeah.
right? Like,
Agreed, agreed. I mean,
and,
as a
and
career strategy though, if super specialty is explicitly a career strategy, sorry, strategy, not just you following your curiosity, something you'd be done doing anyway. One
yeah,
problem is that particular skill set is either automated away or not required anymore. So you don't have a lot of scribes, right? People who know are literate. That's not a thing anymore because everybody is
yeah,
almost like so. That's why I get a little like, and if we want a dynamic society where disruptions happen, that's how you get more and more wealth. The old model of I'm going to study for 25 years and the next 60 years, I'm going to keep milking the same skill. I don't know how relevant. I mean, come on. I mean,
yeah.
so one has to reinvent themselves, and education needs to become more about learning how to learn. Otherwise, there's no point to it. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's generally like because we're talking about like, if your product fails or and I think that's it's really why like your org and your products got to do that, in general, right? Like the internal of the organization should be like, hey, we're learning from
yeah,
doing these things, right? Like, what are
yeah,
we learning from like making these products, right? Like, because if you're too afraid to necessarily look at the bad results, right? Then you won't necessarily learn from them and you'll just keep going, in the wrong direction, and like
mm,
I
yeah.
think that's definitely, not the thing to do, right?
Now, yeah, totally. Okay, so being mindful of the time, I've got three questions.
Sure.
Some of those questions are big, some are not, right? So the first question is, how important is, I guess, good old grit and being stubborn? How good of a how useful is that skill, and where should you be careful if you're too stubborn in this product management?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are things that I am a person who can be convinced of different solutions and
Okay.
perspectives. So I think I would say that you have to be critical but open, right? Like, so, it's kind of just like, you know, in the sense of like where I will be stubborn is if somebody comes and says like you've got to do it this way, right?
Mm,
And
mm,
then offers no evidence to why I should do it that way, right?
yeah.
If you don't provide me any kind of case of like why, like who did you, and or if it was only one person who says something, right? Like so in those ways, I would say I am kind of stubborn in terms of the approach, like I am pretty stubborn in those kind of things. Same thing with like Scrum, in the sense of like Scrum and Scrum activities and kind of management activities and stuff like that, where they're like, oh well, this is the process and this is the way it's supposed to be done, and like a territory authoritative, like this is the way to do Scrum kind of thing, right? Like ultimately, I think like Scrum is a it is a tool that should be used by developers, and I think there is certain aspects that you're trying to get from using Scrum, like autonomy for the developers and satisfaction and those kind of things. So like,
And error
so
correction. I
yeah,
think that's very, yeah.
yeah, and I think sometimes, businesses will be like, oh well, we've got to like track hours, or we've got to track, these kinds of things, and or like you've got to put and sometimes working with QA, they'll be like, oh, you've got to put in the AC, or like you've got to write down these requirements, and so those kinds of things I'm typically stubborn on, just because I want the people who are asking for those things to think about them
Mm.
themselves, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Don't
so
make
like,
increase my work for no reason. Yeah, do you really want it?
yeah, well, and not only do you really want it, but I want you to think about,
Mm.
why, like so like the example of AC, or like, the requirements, like I'll say like, well, I want you to think about what it means to get to the goal, right?
Mm.
And like think of it as the user, so that you can write the AC, right? Like we can do it
Yeah.
collaboratively. If you don't understand the goal, and
Mm.
that's why you need me to help you like write the AC, I'm all for it, right? Like I'm all for like telling, like talking to you about it, saying like, hey, this is what the user's doing on a day-to-day basis. This is going in here. He's gonna click this, and it's got to go here, right? Like,
Yeah.
and then you decide what the AC is, because maybe I'll miss something, right? Like we are a team. Like if your job is quality control, and like quality assurance, then you tell me what I'm missing, right? Like maybe I missed like these three edge cases that like so in that way, I am pretty stubborn, but again, I can always be convinced. And if they tell me
Mm.
like, hey, well, this is the reason why we wanted you to write more, then like let's have a conversation, let's talk about it. And or this is, hey, I want this solution. I'm very stubborn about that, right? Like to say like, okay, what is your real problem? And let's talk about like what you're going through and what's the process, and let's look at it, because maybe that you don't need that, right? Like,
Mm.
and
Mm. Mm.
those all have costs. Like those things all have costs, right? Like, the customer will have a solution in mind. And it's like, maybe that's not what you need, right? Like maybe, and I've found that sometimes it's like training, right? Sometimes it's like, oh, well, what I needed was this thing 4 steps ago. And I'll be like, oh yeah, we already have this right here. Like you just hit this parameter and bam, like, like you're ready to go.
Yeah.
And so, it's like sometimes those are the things that I'm a little bit stubborn on. So
Okay, but would you consider maybe in the future, let's say, because again, this is my concern is sometimes, and this happens in research as well, you need to tell me what you're going to find, so we'll give you money. And the problem is, I don't know what I'm going to find. That's why I need the money. So if somebody has a very strong intuition, somebody that you respect, or has a history of
mm.
leading things, develop like outcome oriented things with
Yeah,
strong
yeah, yeah.
intuitions, would you, I don't know, without a good reason, succumb to what they're saying?
Yeah, but I would find that if somebody is really not, because this happens, right? Like the
Mm.
CEO or somebody who's really knowledgeable will come in, right, and say, and what I find is that usually those people like have a very good reason for why they want to do that the thing,
Okay.
right? Like,
Okay.
I mean, and maybe I've just been lucky that I haven't been in an authoritative environment where they're just like, do this and I don't care what like I don't care what you have to say about it. But like,
Mm.
you know, I've at least been in a place where if I ask the question why, right, then like they'll be able to explain to me their reasoning, and say like, hey, I've worked this for this many years and I see that the people don't do it this way. And so like it won't make sense. Or like if it's somebody from finance that knows like way more than me, they'll be like, oh no, don't do that because the margin on this like product is way higher. So we want to push this one first. And
Yeah.
that's why you should like, so usually I find that like if you do have somebody that's like a CEO or a stakeholder or just somebody who's really knowledge. It could just be somebody who's really knowledgeable. If you ask them why, they'll usually
Mhm.
know the reason why. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
and that's why they're usually at the position that they are. And then and sometimes they will have thoughts of this, like this is just the way that I want to do it, right? Like then I'll ask them and say like really push them on like, well, why do you want like, because sometimes they won't be able to articulate it, right? Like, and that sometimes happens too, right? Like sometimes you'll have a request, somebody won't be able to articulate like why they want it, right? And this will sometimes happen in the same kind of vein of like a high revenue customer say like, hey, I want this, right? And if you really ask them to articulate like why, they may not know how to tell you, what it is. And so I think that's where you work through it and you say like, okay, well, let's start from like the beginning. Like what are you using this for? What is this going on? Right. Like, and that's happened to me before too, right? Like, like this one customer was like, "Hey, I want these reports, right? And like, we've got to have this, right?" And I'm like, "Well, you're not going to need this anymore because once we upgrade, like, you don't need these reports anymore." Or, there's other compromises, right? Like, I'd be like, "Okay, like these are all custom reports, but if you help us build this dashboard for everyone, then I'll do these, I'll throw these custom reports in for you for free or whatever, like."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A negotiation.
Um, yeah, so it's like so I don't find myself in a place where it is just kind of like, hey, this is the way you do it, right? And this is, you should do it like that. Probably the only place that you may kind of witness this a little more is maybe like oil and gas, right? Like because they've been doing it for so long, like that same way, right? But
Yeah.
again, it's like even if you ask them, it's like they'll be like, "Hey, we've done it like this for like 15 years. Like we know like when you're on the site, like I usually find that like they all like the knowledgeable people will know the answer, and if they don't know the answer, then it's my job to help articulate like what it is, what the
Yeah.
reason is, right?
This is a good theory on why disruptors are typically outsiders. Like why do you need like new startup companies if Google's got all this big giant tech company? Why is it not spawning off 1,500 startups of its own? And it probably is, but there is a certain amount of complacency which comes in, and then we've been doing it for 15 years, so we know. Fracking wouldn't have never been invented if that was the case. But anyway, um, okay. Second last question. So that was more like an auxiliary question, and I'm sure I'm gonna end this soon. I promise. But do you have any kind of consideration or something special to say about tangible products versus intangible products versus consultancies? Tangible products, intangible products versus consultancies. Anything, any different way to work around? Think about, conceptualize these problems.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, we kind of touched on it before, but like, consultancy definitely, you probably need to spend a lot more time understanding, the current, you know, landscape. What are they doing? What's their organization like? What are their goals? What are their reasonings for the goals? And there you have like conflicting, organizations too, and conflicting priorities, right? In tangible products, right? Like because the capital costs more, right? Like you'll
Mm.
have some cost of like producing there's also much more time really like doing your customer research and your segment research and your personas, understanding them, and prototyping with them in terms of like pricing, like, making sure like people are interested in the product before,
Mm.
selling it, um, and even like, even if we take the skeleton example, like people like big skeletons, you know what I mean? Like before they brought out the 20-foot one, right? So that's why it even got on the list, right? Like, so it wasn't that big of a bet, that like they would want the bigger one. I guess it's the surprise is when they want, that when it goes crazy, like that people want it. So yeah, so you have to, it's a bigger bet, so you really have to plan for it a lot more. Um, and then and so that's probably the difference between tangible product and software product is like in some ways you can do a lot more experimentation, right, with software product.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like
yeah.
ideally like you can do A/B tests, you can, be, lots of different prototypes and different environments for different users. So like there's like lots of different ways that you can prototype and test
Mm.
and learn like a lot quicker on a software product than you can say
No, I don't-
if it's a product.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember. I mean, I went to an engineering school in India, then dropped out and went again to an engineering school in England. But in the Indian engineering school, we still had hand-drawn engineering design, and CAD, computer-aided design, was just coming up. And I can only
Yeah.
imagine that how much it must have saved, and how agile it would have made at least the design phase
Oh
of what you
yeah,
wanted to
for
do.
sure. For sure. Even like, so yeah, I mean before I started, like even in building, right? Like
Mm.
before all like, and realistically you couldn't even like get AutoCAD well, like you couldn't really do estimations off of AutoCAD that well.
Yeah,
So like even though it was digital, right? Like nobody had the software to like to open up the file and then like do estimates off of it. So like,
yeah,
there's so much transformation in like the ability to like kind of bring products quickly, right? And solve people's
yeah,
problems,
yeah, yeah. I can tell you, I'm quite excited about the book called "Where's My Flying Car" and the full potential of nanotechnology, as talked about by Richard Feynman. If there are
Yeah, yeah.
product managers, if you want product managers, I am hire me, because that is one project I want to be associated with in any capacity. Yeah. Okay. Last question, and this I'm going to try and I've started a new thing where I keep the last question the same, and it's a bit of a twist on Peter Thiel's famous question. What is your, I'm going to call it assumption, but I don't mean it as a bad thing. But like, what is something that you consider so fundamental in your project management space that if proven untrue, you'll have to really rethink your models about how you work.
Um, I guess probably the marketing and the product, like if there was some sort of study to find that like it's that nobody cares about the marketing and it's really just the product itself that people look at objectively,
Mhm.
that fuels their outputs, then maybe that would be something that I have to rethink, because
In
that's really part of my way of looking at it.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I mean, I know it's the last question, but like commodities are essentially that, in a way, if you look at it. I mean, yes, BP has BP oil and Shell has Shell oil, but it's just bloody oil. So
Yeah.
I guess if the theory is everything should become a commodity, which is kind of beginning, but all this kind of work happens at the cutting edge, because everything is becoming either a utility or a commodity, if that's what you think about it. But that's a good answer. That's interesting. So all the theories are going to go out of the window if marketing is not important.
Well, I mean, even commodities, if you really think about it, are the same way, right? Like
Mm,
there's still like if orange juice concentrate, right? If people don't buy orange juice, right,
yeah,
then
yeah,
the commodity, right? So like there's
right.
a
Like the
there's
meta
a
marketing.
yeah, there's definitely a supply and demand, curve in that makes, and that um helps that commodity work and the price of that commodity work, so
Okay.
like
So supply and demand is not natural then. That's what you're saying. You're saying interventions can work, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I think there is definitely, I mean, we see it all the time in like, conspicuous consumption, right? Like there's no need for those items, right? But like I don't know, at least every mall I've gone to, I've seen all these like shoes that are like 400, $500, right? Like you don't necessarily, the value of that
Yeah,
shoe, that's all marketing, right? Like, and what the
yeah.
cost is. So I don't necessarily think that it's, you know.
Yeah, no, but this is perfect. This is something to chew on. I'm going to think about this for sure because I thought commodities don't need marketing, but of course they do. Hey, of course they do. Well, well, perfect. So thank you for coming in. Any parting thoughts about to the viewers?
No, no, I think that's it. Thanks for having me on and taking the time to talk. It's fun.
Perfect. All right. So I'm going to catch you in the debrief and see you around. Bye bye.
All right, sounds good.
Okay. So give me 1 second.